Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The room was full, maps pinned on the wall, the hum of the projector filling the silence, men shifting in their chairs, papers sliding back and forth. Orders barked, tasks assigned. But when the commander's finger swept across the room, when names were called out, her chair remained untouched by his glance. She didn't flinch, didn't protest. She just sat there, hands folded over her notebook, lips pressed into the faintest line. Some mistook it for weakness. They always did. They thought she preferred silence because she had nothing to add, but the truth was she carried more weight than most of them would ever know. The commander's voice cut through the dim fluorescent light. Primary strike team, Ramirez, Cole, Henderson. His eyes never stopped on her. She shifted slightly, the faint scrape of her boot against concrete drawing a glance from the man beside her. He gave a short, knowing smirk, one of those looks that said, "You're not needed here." But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. The map burned itself into her memory. Coordinates, routes, a red circle over a compound deep in the mountains, drawn with the thick press of a marker. She memorized every line without a word. Silence was her gift, but silence was also her burden. The briefing ended in a blur of chairs scraping and men muttering half-jokes about the mission's odds. She closed her notebook, rose slowly and walked out. No one stopped her. No one asked her thoughts. And that was their first mistake. Outside, the air smelled of sand and engine fuel. Helicopters waited, rotors stilled, their shadows long under the setting sun. She stood for a moment at the edge of the tarmac, the hum of the bass settling in her chest. Radios crackled. Boots thudded. Laughter trailed from a group leaning against the armory wall. She adjusted the strap of her pack, fingers brushing over a patch stitched onto the fabric. A name, a date. No one alive here knew what it meant. She never told them. Her silence kept her safe. It also kept them from seeing the truth, that every mission she accepted, every order she followed, was tied to something deeper, something far beyond strategy or chain of command. Because this mission was not just another operation. For her, it was personal. The call came for wheels up. She moved with the others, quiet in her steps, her eyes scanning faces. Ramirez joked about leaving in one piece. Henderson spat into the dirt before climbing aboard. She said nothing, just adjusted her rifle, checked her sidearm, and stepped onto the bird. The interior smelled of metal, grease, sweat. The thump of boots against the deck echoed louder than voices. She sat in the corner, head low, hands tightening around the strap of her harness as the rotors roared to life. Wind blasted, the helicopter lifted, the ground dropped away. And in that deafening moment, when all sound collapsed into the rush of air and machine, she let her thoughts drift to her father. He had worn the same uniform years before. He had left on missions that were never fully explained, never fully returned from. Pieces of him came back, medals, letters, stories told by men who drank too much to keep them straight, but never him, not whole. She had grown up in his silence, learned to read strength in the pauses between words, learned that dignity didn't always need a voice. And now she carried that same silence into war. The mission briefing echoed in her head, a compound dug into stone, hostile forces entrenched, minimal intel on numbers. They were to secure, extract, and destroy, clean, simple, or at least on paper. But she had seen something the others hadn't. A mark on the map barely visible tucked near the red circle. A supply road, too narrow for convoys, too hidden for satellite eyes. She knew because she had seen it before. This wasn't her first time near those mountains. But no one had asked her. The helicopter tilted, the horizon spinning. Someone muttered about turbulence. She stayed still, watching the shadow of the mountains rise against the fatting sky. Her pulse stayed even, but deep inside a quiet ache stirred. The closer they drew, the heavier it felt, as though the mountains themselves remembered her, as though they whispered her father's name. They landed hard, dust spiraling into their faces. Engines cut. Silence slammed down. Boots hit dirt. Orders murmured low. The team spread out, rifles lifted, eyes sharp in the growing dark. She moved with them, each step measured, each breath calm. But she felt it, the distance between them and her. The invisible line of mistrust. They saw her as the quiet one, the outsider, a ghost in their formation. She let them believe it, because silence gave her the advantage of listening. And tonight, the mountains were telling her everything. The crunch of gravel, the echo of wind between rocks, the faint rustle too heavy for an animal, too distant for one of them. She caught it, tilted her head, narrowed her eyes. They didn't notice. She raised her hand. No one looked. She whispered movement. No one heard. And so she fell silent again. The night deepened. They climbed higher, packs dragging at their shoulders, rifles clutched tight. The compound loomed unseen but felt, an absence of stars where the rock swallowed them. The commander halted them, whispered an order to hold position. Men crouched low, weapons angled. She lingered a step behind, her gaze fixed on the black ridges above. She felt it before it happened, the stillness, the breath caught in the world around them. Then the crack of a rifle. One man fell, his body jerking, a cry ripped out of his chest. The silence shattered. Gunfire tore the night open. Shouts, flashes, rocks sparking with bullets. Chaos. She dropped low, breath steady, eyes cutting through the madness. The team scrambled, blind in their fury, firing at shadows that shifted faster than they could follow. She found cover, pressed against stone, her heart pounding not with fear, but with clarity. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was focus. She counted shots, traced angles, saw what they couldn't. And when she raised her rifle, her breath fell into that same rhythm her father had taught her in the quiet fields back home. One squeeze, one crack. The enemy rifle fell silent. Another shot, another silence. Around her, the team shouted, panicked, but slowly the tide shifted. Slowly, they realized the shadows weren't as many as they'd feared. Slowly, they began to push forward again. And none of them saw her, working in the dark, pulling them out of disaster one shot at a time. When the last echo faded, the night lay heavy once more. Bodies sprawled on the rocks. Smoke lifted from the dirt. The commander barked for a regroup. The men gathered, breaths ragged, faces pale. One limped, another clutched a wound wrapped in cloth. She walked in last, rifle low, eyes calm. They looked at her just briefly, confusion flickering, suspicion, maybe even respect. But she said nothing. She just tightened the strap of her pack, glanced once at the road the map had failed to show, and followed when the commander moved out again. Her silence carried them onward. And still they didn't know. Not what she had seen, not what she carried, not why this mission mattered more to her than any of them could imagine. Not yet. That night, as the wind swept cold over the mountains and the team rested in uneasy shifts, she sat apart, her rifle across her knees, her eyes distant. Someone asked her quietly, "Why don't you ever speak up?" She didn't answer. She only looked back at him, her gaze steady, unreadable. Because some truths weren't meant for words. Some were meant for silence. What did the mountains remember that the others could not? She woke before the rest, though she'd barely slept. The cold clung to her skin, sharp against her lungs with every breath. The stars above were fading, bruised by the first touch of dawn. Around her, the men slept in uneven rhythms, groans, restless turns, muttered words from dreams they would never admit to. Her rifle lay across her lap. Her hands rested on it as if it were an extension of her own silence. She stared into the dark valleys below, listening, always listening. And she heard it, the faint rattle of stones disturbed, too far for most to notice, too soft for anyone else half asleep. But she caught it. The mountains never lied to her. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't move, didn't wake the others. Sometimes silence was the only way to confirm a suspicion. The sound faded, the wind shifted, nothing followed. But she knew they were being watched. She kept it to herself. Not because she didn't care about the others, but because she needed to be sure. Because if she spoke too soon, they'd dismiss her like they always did. And if she stayed silent, she could prove it later when it mattered most. By sunrise, the camp stirred. Men strapped on their gear, voices low, faces drawn. Henderson's wound was worse than he admitted. She noticed the stiffness in his gait, the clench of his jaw when he thought no one looked. She almost said something, almost. But then Cole laughed at his own joke, too loud, too careless, and the moment slipped. She checked her gear again instead. The commander gave orders in clipped tones. They'd push higher, flank the compound from the east. Ramirez muttered about terrain, about angles they couldn't hold. The commander shut him down. No room for debate. She said nothing, though she knew Ramirez was right. She knew the eastern path would expose them, pin them against open rock. She had seen this mountain before, not on this mission, not in this war, but long ago when she wasn't a soldier. When she was just a daughter. Her father's voice returned, softer than the morning wind. He had brought her here once, not these exact ridges, but mountains just as merciless. He had taught her silence there, the stillness of a scope, the patience of waiting for the right breath. "Words won't save you out here," he'd said. "Only quiet will." She had carried that lesson into every mission since. Now, watching the commander lead them east, she felt the weight of his absence more than ever. The climb punished them. The sun rose high, heat baking off the stone. Their boots scraped, echoing across empty ridges. The silence of the land pressed on them until nerves frayed. Cole cursed under his breath. Ramirez muttered about being sitting ducks. Henderson dragged his steps but never spoke of the pain. She walked behind them all, steady, unshaken. Her silence became a shield, not just for herself but for them. Every sound that didn't belong, every shift in the air, she noticed. And then it came again, the rattle of stone, this time closer, this time certain. She froze. Her eyes scanned the ridges above. Nothing moved, nothing visible, but she knew. She reached forward, touched Ramirez's shoulder, shook her head once. A warning. He frowned, about to speak, but her eyes stopped him. She pointed upward, 2 fingers, a shadow against stone. It was gone in an instant, but enough for Ramirez to pale. He whispered something to the commander. The commander glanced back at her, his eyes narrowed, suspicion, disbelief. But then a shot cracked the silence. The air exploded. Dust, rock, shouting. The ambush was real. They scattered, diving for what little cover the rock allowed. Bullets ripped through stone, chips stinging skin. The enemy had waited above, patient, silent, just as she had feared. She pressed flat, rifle up, breath even. Her silence became her weapon. One target, one breath, one shot. Another fell. The team was pinned, fear splintering their formation. Cole fired wildly, wasted rounds clattering hot across the rocks. Henderson gritted through the pain, his shots more grim determination than aim. Ramirez shouted, voice cracking through the chaos. She stayed quiet, let the world shrink into scope and trigger, into pulse and breath. She picked them off one by one, each shot controlled, each silence reclaimed. And slowly the enemy's fire thinned, until the mountain went still again. The commander regrouped them, his face tight, sweat cutting trails through dust. 2 men had grazes, Henderson's wound bled heavier now, but they were alive. And for the first time, his eyes lingered on her. "You knew," he said. She didn't answer. His jaw tightened. "Next time you say something." Her silence remained unbroken. Because if she explained, if she told him she'd known the mountain's voice since she was a girl, that her father had taught her the difference between the silence of stone and the silence of danger, he wouldn't believe her. They never did. So she carried it alone. The day stretched on, heat turning to haze, haze to shadow. They neared the compound, its walls carved from stone, camouflaged against the ridges. A fortress born from the mountain itself. The men grew tense, voices low, steps cautious. She felt something else, not fear, not tension, but the weight of memory. Because she had seen those walls before. Not in this war, not in this lifetime of orders and ranks, but in old photographs, hidden in her father's things, places he'd been, missions he'd never spoken of. This was one of them. Her heart tightened. Her silence deepened. Night fell again. They set up a watch near the ridge, the compound in sight. Plans whispered, routes debated, the commander's voice hard, decisive. She sat apart once more, her eyes fixed on the fortress carved into stone. Her fingers brushed the patch on her pack, the one with the name and the date. Her father's name, the date he never returned. She had found it once, scribbled on an old map he'd left behind. A circle over these same coordinates. A mission never spoken of, buried in silence. And now she was here, walking the same path. The truth hit her like the mountain's weight pressing down. She wasn't just on another mission. She was standing where her father had vanished. The men around her didn't know. They wouldn't understand. To them, this was just another target, another compound, another night waiting for the storm to break. But for her, it was the echo of a life unfinished. A silence that had consumed her family, one she had carried all these years. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of tears threaten. She pushed them back, swallowed them whole. Because tears wouldn't serve her here. Silence would. Later, Ramirez sat near her, rubbing dirt from his hands. He spoke quietly, not looking at her. "You saved us back there, twice now." She didn't respond. He sighed, "You don't have to say anything, just I see it, even if they don't." His words hung in the air, soft, almost kind. For a moment she almost broke her silence, almost told him the truth, that she wasn't saving them for their sake alone, that every shot she took, every step she made was for someone who never came home. But the words died in her throat. She only gave a faint nod, barely there. And he understood enough. The compound loomed in the dark, silent, waiting. Tomorrow they would breach it. Tomorrow everything would break open. She lay down with her rifle across her chest, staring at the stars her father once stared at. And in the silence of the mountain night, she whispered, barely audible, words only the wind would hear. "I'll finish what you started." Why did the compound look less like a fortress and more like a tomb? The mountain air was cold enough to bite, thin enough to remind them how far from safety they were. Dawn had not yet come, but the black sky was beginning to fade, bleeding gray along the horizon. The team crouched low on the ridge, eyes fixed on the walls below. The compound sat half buried in stone, its outline jagged, almost natural, like the mountain itself had grown claws to protect it. Barbed wire glinted faintly in the starlight. A single guard walked the outer path, his shadow long across the dirt. The commander whispered the plan: entry from the north wall, Ramirez to cut the power, Cole to set charges on the east flank, Henderson on overwatch, though his wound made it questionable. And her. Her name wasn't called, again. She stayed silent, her breath calm, her eyes fixed on the compound. She already knew the plan had flaws. Too many exposed angles, too many assumptions about guard rotations. But she said nothing, because silence was her place, and silence was her edge. The descent began. Boots slid against loose stone, scraping too loud in the stillness. Sweat cut cold against the back of her neck despite the chill. She moved last, eyes scanning not just the walls, but the spaces between them, shadows where her father might once have stood. Every detail of the compound struck her with a sharp edge of recognition. The slope of the walls, the way the gate was recessed, the faint outline of a collapsed watchtower. It was the same as in the photograph she'd found years ago, tucked inside his old duffel. Faded, folded, corners torn, but unmistakable. She wasn't just walking into an enemy stronghold. She was walking into her father's last known memory. They reached the outer wall. Ramirez went to work, his tools clinking softly. Sparks flashed once, then darkness returned. Cole muttered about timing, about needing speed. The commander silenced him with a glare. Minutes stretched like hours, each second another reminder of how loud their breathing sounded, how fragile their cover was. She crouched close to the stone, one hand pressed against its rough surface. She closed her eyes, let the mountain speak through her skin. And she felt it: vibrations, movement inside, heavy steps shuffling, not many, less than expected. Her eyes opened. Something was wrong. The power died. Lights along the wall flickered out. Ramirez exhaled in relief. "Go," the commander ordered. Cole moved to the gate, charges ready, the rest prepared to breach. She lingered a step back, her chest tight. Why were there so few footsteps inside? Why was the silence heavier than it should be? The explosion split the night open. The gate blew inward, a thunder of dust and steel. Shouts erupted. Gunfire followed, wild, uncontrolled. The team surged forward, weapons raised, voices lost in the chaos. She stayed behind a heartbeat longer, long enough to hear it, the echo that wasn't quite right. The enemy fire wasn't coming from the walls, it was deeper, drawn out. A trap. She ran after them, slipping into the compound as the dust swirled thick, the air choking with grit and smoke. Shapes moved ahead, her team against unseen shadows. Bullets sparked stone. Metal screamed. She dropped low, rifle up, breath steady. Through the haze, she caught glimpses. Ramirez firing blind into a doorway. Cole dragging Henderson out of a line of fire. The commander shouting orders no one could hear. And in the chaos, she saw the walls for what they were, not defenses. Gravestones. Her father's last steps echoed in them. A burst of gunfire snapped her back. An enemy slipped through the smoke, rifle raised toward Cole's exposed side. Her breath slowed. One shot. The man crumpled. Cole spun, eyes wide, then gave a quick nod before vanishing into the fight. She didn't nod back. Her eyes were already shifting, scanning, searching. Every corner of the compound screamed familiarity. Even the patterns of bullet scars across the stone felt known, as if her father's ghost had marked them. She wondered, had he stood right where she was now? Had he looked at these same walls, felt the same silence pressing in, known the same trap waiting in the dark? Her chest ached. Her silence deepened. The fight dragged them deeper. Hallways carved from rock swallowed them whole. Lights flickered from generators, buzzing faint, casting shadows that stretched and snapped with every movement. The compound was more maze than fortress. Doors sealed, corridors twisting. And always that silence beneath the gunfire, a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt haunted. They cleared a room, another, then another. Bodies fell, both theirs and the enemy. Ramirez cursed as he reloaded. Cole's face was pale, his jokes gone. Henderson's breathing was ragged, each step a battle. The commander pushed them onward, his voice tight. She followed, but her eyes weren't just on the fight. They were on the walls, the scars, the pieces of memory hidden in stone. And then she saw it. A mark, faint, carved into the wall near a doorway. Her father's initials. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It was impossible, it had to be, but she knew that carving. The way the second letter slanted. She had seen it before, etched into his old tools, scratched onto his field notebook. Her knees weakened. Her silence nearly broke. But she swallowed it. Because this was not the moment. Not yet. The team pressed on, but every step she took after that was heavier. every sound sharper, every shadow filled with the memory of him. Her father had been here, not just in rumors, not just in photographs. Here, and if he had left his mark, then maybe there was more. Maybe he hadn't just vanished. Maybe something of him remained. They reached the central chamber. The air was thicker here. Dust hung low, stirred by their boots. The walls rose higher, lined with crates and weapons stacked in careless towers. But it wasn't the weapons that froze her. It was the silence. Total crushing. Too much. She gripped her rifle tighter, her breath shallow. Then she heard it, metal clicking, faint but clear. "Down!" she shouted before she could stop herself. The team dropped just as a volley of fire tore through the chamber. Shadows erupted from the crates, enemy soldiers, hidden, waiting. The trap closed. The fight was savage. Bullets ricocheted, stones split, men screamed. The commander roared orders, trying to rally. Cole dragged Ramirez into cover. Henderson, pale and shaking, still fired until his rifle clicked empty. And she became the silence again. Her shots cut through the chaos, measured, precise. Each trigger pull another step closer to survival. But her mind wasn't only on the fight. It was on the wall behind the crates. Another mark, another carving. This one deeper, clearer. Her father's name. Not initials. A full name. And beside it, a date. The same date stitched on the patch she carried. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred. This wasn't just where he vanished. This was where he had died. Her silence broke, but not in words. In fury. She fired faster, sharper, her breath ragged, her body moving with a force she couldn't explain. The others saw it. Ramirez stared between shots. Cole muttered something under his breath. Even the commander froze for a second at the precision, the relentlessness. But none of them knew why. None of them saw the ghost she saw. None of them felt the silence she carried. The last enemy fell. The chamber went still, smoke curling in the stale air. The team collapsed into cover, panting, wounded, drained. She stood apart, her rifle lowered, her eyes locked on the carving. Her father's name. Her father's silence. Her silence. She reached out, fingertips brushing the rough stone, as if she could touch him through it. As if the years of unanswered questions could dissolve in one gesture. But the stone was cold, and silence gave nothing back. Behind her, the commander called her name. For the first time, he didn't sound dismissive. He sounded uncertain. "What did you find?" She turned, eyes shadowed, lips pressed tight. Her silence held. Because she couldn't tell him yet. Because if she did, it would no longer be hers. And some burdens were meant to be carried alone. Why did the silence of stone feel heavier than the sound of war? The chamber still smelled of smoke and blood. Gunfire echoes clung to the walls, fading only to reveal a deeper quiet, a quiet that pressed on lungs, seeped into skin. The men sat slumped in their cover, catching breath, reloading with trembling hands. She stood apart, one hand against the wall, her fingers brushing over the carving. The stone was rough beneath her touch, the grooves cut sharp, deliberate, not random, not chance. Her father's name. Her father's date. Proof that he had been here, proof that he had not walked away. Her throat tightened. The patch on her pack, the one she had carried for years, felt suddenly heavier, as if the fabric itself absorbed the truth she had just found. He hadn't disappeared in some nameless valley. He hadn't been swallowed by rumor. He had died here, in this compound, in silence. She lowered her hand slowly, her pulse unsteady. Behind her, Ramirez pushed himself upright, sweat streaking through dirt on his face. His eyes found her, saw the wall, saw her hand. "You see something?" he asked, voice rough. She froze. The words burned on her tongue. She wanted to tell him, to break her silence and finally give voice to the ghost she carried. But then she remembered the briefing table, the dismissive glances, the mistrust, the way silence had become her only shield. If she told them now, it would be taken from her, twisted, made into orders, into strategy, into something less than what it was. Her father's silence wasn't meant for their command. It was meant for her. She shook her head once. Nothing. Ramirez studied her for a moment, then nodded, though his eyes lingered with quiet doubt. The commander barked orders, pulling them back into motion. The compound was only half cleared. They had more ground to cover, more doors to breach. But his voice didn't carry the same weight as before. He looked at her differently now, not with trust, not with respect, with suspicion. Because he had seen the same thing Ramirez had, her pause at the wall, her silence that held more than it admitted. He didn't ask, not yet, but his silence was different from hers. His was distrust. They moved through the corridors again, boots dragging over dirt floors, rifles raised at shadows that stretched too long. Every step took them deeper, past rooms littered with weapons, past crates stenciled with markings they didn't recognize. The air grew thicker, colder. She felt it in her bones, the weight of stone, the echo of something unfinished. Her father's presence clung to every wall. And with every corner they turned, her silence became harder to carry. Hours passed in fragments of violence and silence, short bursts of gunfire, doors kicked open, empty rooms filled with dust and memory. The men wore down, shoulders slumped, eyes dulled, even the commander's tone cracked at the edges. Henderson moved slower, blood soaking through the bandage on his side. Still, he refused to fall back. She noticed his breaths, uneven, shallow, not the kind that lasted long. When the commander called a halt, the men collapsed into corners, weapons slack in their hands. She sat apart again, back against stone, rifle across her knees. Her eyes returned to the silence, always the silence. It was Henderson who broke it. He slid down near her, grimacing as his wound pulled. For a long moment he didn't speak, just stared at the ground, jaw clenched, breath thin. Then quietly, "They think you don't care." Her eyes flicked toward him. He smirked faintly, though it was bitter more than amused. "That's what they say, that you sit there in silence because none of this matters to you, but I don't believe that." She didn't move, didn't answer. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing at her. "So what's the truth?" Her throat tightened. Words swelled, desperate to break through. She wanted to tell him everything, the carving, the patch, the weight of carrying her father's unfinished story into this same compound. But silence held her back, because silence was her only way to keep it hers. Henderson sighed, leaning his head against the wall. "Doesn't matter, you'll keep it to yourself anyway." He closed his eyes, his voice softer now. "But for what it's worth, I think you care more than all of us combined. That's why you don't speak. Not because you're empty, because you're carrying too much." Her chest ached. She turned her eyes away before he could see. Because he was right. They rested only briefly, before the commander pushed them on again. The deeper corridors felt older, carved less for war and more for hiding. The walls closed in, ceilings lower, the air stale. Every sound magnified, the crunch of boots, the scrape of gear, the faint drip of water somewhere unseen. The silence here was different, not just heavy, not just haunted. It was waiting. They reached a reinforced door, thicker than the others, bolted and chained. Cole muttered under his breath, eyeing it. "Whatever's in there, it's what they're protecting." The commander ordered Ramirez to prep charges. As he worked, she felt it again, the vibration in the stone, not footsteps, not voices, something else. A hum. Her skin prickled. This wasn't just a weapons cache. Something darker lay behind that door. She swallowed hard, her silence trembling inside her. She almost broke it, almost warned them. But then the charges blew. The door cracked open, dust billowing. They raised their rifles, flashlights cutting into the dark. And what they saw wasn't weapons. It was rooms filled with cages. Cages with chains. Cages with stains on the floor that spoke of suffering long silenced. The men froze, their breath caught, even the commander's voice failed him. Her heart stopped. Her father's silence wasn't the only one buried here. The team moved cautiously inside, the beam of light sweeping across rusted bars and shackled chains. The air smelled of iron, of rot, of something long kept from sunlight. Cole whispered, "What the hell is this place?" No one answered, because the silence did. She walked slower than the rest, her boots scuffing against the stone. Her eyes trailed over the cages, the marks carved into the walls, the echoes of voices that had never escaped. Her father's name had been on the outside wall. But what if his silence had ended in here? Her chest constricted, breath shallow. She clenched her rifle tighter, as if gripping it would hold her together. Ramirez muttered a prayer under his breath. Henderson turned his face away, eyes burning with something beyond pain. The commander tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Document it, move through, fast. But even he couldn't disguise the tremor in his tone. She lingered near the last cage. Her light fell across the wall inside. Another carving. Not her father's name this time. But a word. One word. Daughter. Her knees nearly buckled. Her silence shattered inside, though no sound escaped. Because this wasn't just proof of his death. It was proof that in his final moments, in the silence of this place, he had thought of her. Her hands trembled. Her heart broke. And yet her silence held. Because what could she possibly say that would carry the weight of that single word carved into stone? Behind her, the men moved on, their lights flickering into deeper rooms, their voices low, unsettled. She stayed frozen, staring at the word. Her father's silence had become her own. And now she understood why. Because sometimes words were too fragile for truth. Sometimes silence was the only way to carry it. What happens to a soldier when the silence around him screams louder than war? The cages didn't let them breathe. Not really. The rusted bars, the chains bolted into stone, the stains that time couldn't erase, every detail told stories no one wanted to hear. Stories of men and women stripped of voice, reduced to shadows. They tried to move past it, tried to follow orders, but their steps dragged. Eyes lingered too long. Hands shook when they gripped weapons. Because this wasn't combat, it wasn't even resistance. This was suffering preserved. And each of them knew it could have been them. Cole cracked first. He leaned against the wall, helmet tilted back, breathing fast, almost panicked. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. "This isn't what we signed up for. They didn't tell us about this." His voice echoed down the corridor, trembling against stone. The commander snapped at him, "Quiet." But it was too late. The silence was broken and something had spilled out. Cole's eyes darted from cage to cage, sweat dripping. "You don't get it. This isn't a mission. This is a grave. We're walking in a grave." Ramirez stepped in, his tone sharp but not unkind. "Shut it down, Cole. Don't give this place more power than it already has." But Cole wasn't listening. His breathing quickened, chest rising and falling like he couldn't get enough air. He pressed a hand against his own throat, as if testing to see if he was still free. She watched silent, her stomach tight. Because Cole wasn't wrong. This wasn't just a compound. It was a silence meant to erase. And her father had been part of it. Henderson pushed himself off the wall, wincing as his wound pulled, but his voice cut through the tension. "Cole." The younger man froze, eyes darting to him. "You breathe because they didn't. You walk because they couldn't. You carry your weapon because they were stripped of theirs. Don't disgrace them by falling apart now." The words landed heavy. Cole swallowed, blinking fast, then gave a sharp nod. His hands still trembled, but he forced them back to his rifle. The silence closed in again. But it wasn't the same silence. Now it carried fragility, a silence that might crack again at any moment. They pressed on, deeper into corridors that wound like veins through the earth. The cages gave way to tunnels. The air was colder, damper. The drip of unseen water grew louder. And yet the memory of those cages followed them. Every sound seemed sharper now, every shadow longer. Even the commander moved with less certainty, his orders clipped, his voice lower. She walked near the back, her eyes scanning walls, her thoughts a storm. Her father's carving, the word he had left, daughter. It pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat. Why had he been here, captured, abandoned, forgotten? And why had command never told her? Questions piled on questions, but she held them all inside. Because silence was the only way to keep them hers. They reached another chamber, wider this time with collapsed beams and shattered crates. Dust floated thick in the flashlight beams. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. Too clean, too arranged. The commander raised a fist, signaling halt. They froze, rifles raised, scanning. Her ears strained against the quiet. And then she heard it. A faint scrape, metal against stone. Not ahead, above. Her breath caught. Up, she whispered. The commander's head snapped toward her, but before he could question, the ceiling cracked. A flash, a grenade dropped through the dust. They dove. The blast tore through the chamber, shaking the walls, filling the air with smoke and debris. Shouts echoed above, enemy voices, boots pounding. They weren't alone. The compound wasn't abandoned. It was a trap. Gunfire poured down from openings in the ceiling. Bullets sparked off stone, ricocheted, ripped through crates. The team scrambled for cover, returning fire blind through smoke. Cole screamed as rounds shattered the wall beside him. Henderson dragged him down, groaning from the effort. Ramirez cursed, firing in controlled bursts. The commander shouted orders, but the roar of battle swallowed his words. She pressed against the wall, heart racing, ears ringing. And yet through the chaos, her father's silence pressed against her chest. This was the place where he had died. And now, maybe, it would claim her too. She forced breath steady, raised her rifle, and aimed upward through the smoke. One shot clean. An enemy body fell, thudding hard against stone. Another shout, another shadow. She shifted, eyes narrowing, and fired again. The crack of her shots cut through the chaos, precise, steady. The others noticed. Even through panic, they saw the silence in her movements. Ramirez shouted over the gunfire. She's locking them down, cover her. They shifted their fire, giving her angles. One by one, she picked off the shapes above, until the chamber quieted again. The silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it was broken by the weight of smoke, by the smell of blood, by the sound of shallow breathing around her. The commander pushed himself up, coughing, scanning the ceiling. They knew we were coming. Ramirez spat dust, shaking his head. Then why wait until now? The commander didn't answer. He looked at her, long, sharp. Because he knew. He had seen her at the carving. He had watched her pause. And now, when silence had saved them, it had come from her rifle. His eyes narrowed. Suspicion deepened. The team regrouped in the chamber, coughing through dust, checking wounds. Cole was shaken but alive. Henderson was pale, his bandage soaked darker now, but he refused to lie down. They didn't speak much. Words felt brittle. Even victory here felt hollow. Because the silence of the cages still lingered, and now the silence of the ambush pressed harder. She sat apart, back against stone, rifle balanced across her knees. Her father's word carved into the wall burned in her mind. Daughter. She wanted to speak it aloud, to let them know, to let someone share the weight. But she couldn't, because silence wasn't weakness. It was strength, and strength meant carrying it alone. Later, when the men finally drifted into uneasy rest, she stayed awake. Her eyes traced the cracks in the stone ceiling. Her ears caught every drip of water, every shuffle of boots, every faint whisper of wind. Her mind drifted to him, to his last moments, to the way his silence had been forced upon him. And then to the word he had carved, the last word he had chosen. He hadn't written soldier. He hadn't written mission. He had written daughter. And in that single word, he had passed something to her. Not just his silence, but his purpose. The commander stirred, his gaze catching hers in the dim light. Neither spoke, but his eyes said what his voice wouldn't. "What are you hiding?" She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her silence met his suspicion and held firm. Because the truth wasn't his to carry. It was hers. And no matter what this compound held, no matter what dangers still lay ahead, her silence would outlast them all. Why did the commander keep watching her instead of the walls? The silence of the chamber hadn't healed, it had hardened. Smoke still clung to the air, making every breath scratch. Dust settled on their gear, in their hair, in the lines on their faces. And yet the weight in the room wasn't the smoke. It was his eyes on her. She sat against the wall, rifle resting across her knees, unmoving. But she felt it, his gaze cutting through her silence, sharper than any blade. He wanted to ask. He wanted to rip her secret from her chest. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he leaned closer to Ramirez, whispering something too low for her to catch. The words weren't for her ears, but the suspicion in them was. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. Silence had always been her shield. Now it felt like a noose. The men shifted uneasily. Henderson's face had gone pale, his bandage darker now, his strength waning. Cole sat with his back to the wall, staring at the ceiling as if it might crack again. Ramirez paced like a caged animal, restless energy spilling into every step. No one joked anymore. No one filled the silence with small talk. They were unraveling. And the cages behind them had started the tear. When the commander finally stood, his voice was low but firm. "We move. We don't stop until we're clear." Cole muttered, shaking his head. "Clear of what? This place doesn't end." Ramirez snapped back, sharper than needed. "Then we make it end." The words fell flat, hollow, because the silence around them had no end. They moved again, deeper into corridors that bent like broken ribs. The air was colder here. Their lights cast shadows that didn't fade, stretching across stone like reaching fingers. Every sound mattered now. The crunch of boots, the click of safeties, the shallow hiss of Henderson's breathing. And then something else. Distant, muffled. A voice. Not theirs. They froze. The commander raised a fist. Everyone stilled, weapons up, ears straining. The voice came again, low, murmured, foreign. Not one voice, several. "Enemy." Her heart pounded, not from fear but from something deeper. Because those voices were inside the same compound, where her father had left his last word. The same walls that had kept him silent. Now they carried his killers. She steadied her rifle, her silence coiling tight inside her chest. The commander looked at her, a question in his eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't shake her head. Only silence. And it told him enough. He motioned forward. They crept closer, shadows hugging stone. The voices grew clearer, sharper, overlapping in rhythm. Chanting. Praying. Or maybe promising. She couldn't tell, but the cadence carried weight. The kind of weight that didn't break easily. Her stomach tightened. Because silence wasn't the only strength in this place. Theirs was waiting for them. The chamber opened suddenly, wider than any before. And they saw them. Figures, dozens, armed, waiting. Torches flickered against stone, smoke curling to the ceiling. Weapons glinted, eyes followed. The enemy wasn't scattered, they were gathered. Prepared. And the team had walked straight into their jaws. The first shot cracked before anyone could breathe. A torch shattered, sparks scattering. Then came the flood, gunfire roaring, bullets screaming across the chamber. The team dove for cover, returning fire in bursts. Stone splintered, dust erupted. The silence of before was gone, replaced by the thunder of survival. Ramirez shouted over the chaos, his rifle spitting fire. Cole screamed, fear in his voice but his trigger steady. Henderson groaned, his body straining as he dragged himself into position, refusing to fall back. The commander barked orders, voice sharp, cutting through noise. But it was her silence that carried weight. She moved like shadow, eyes steady, shots precise. Each pull of her trigger was deliberate, exact, cutting down targets with quiet finality. Her silence was louder than their shouting. The enemy pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming. Torches flickered, smoke burned eyes, the air filled with screams. They were surrounded. The commander cursed, pulling a grenade, hurling it into the swarm. The blast tore through bodies, the echo rattling stone. "Push through," he roared. They surged forward, firing, clawing through chaos. Her rifle barked, her silence unwavering. And for a moment the tide bent. But survival demanded blood. Cole stumbled, a round grazing his arm. He cried out, spinning, but Ramirez pulled him back before he fell. Henderson collapsed to one knee, blood soaking him now, his rifle shaking in weak hands. She saw him, heart pounding, instincts screaming to go to him. But she couldn't, not yet. Because if she broke silence now, if she broke formation, they'd all fall. So she kept firing. Her silence cut where her words could not. The fight stretched endless, minutes blurred, smoke thickened, the walls felt closer, the air thinner. But slowly, slowly, the enemy broke. Bodies littered the stone, their chants silenced, their torches extinguished. And then at last, only echoes remained. The team collapsed behind cover, chests heaving, sweat streaking through grime. No cheers, no victory cries. Only silence. Because victory here wasn't triumph, it was survival. The commander looked at her, not with suspicion now, with calculation. Because he had seen her silence hold the line. He had seen it steady when the rest broke. And it unnerved him. "Who the hell are you really?" he muttered under his breath. She met his gaze and answered with silence. Because some truths weren't meant for him. Some truths weren't meant for anyone. Only for her. Later, when the gunfire's echoes had faded and the chamber lay heavy with smoke, the men slumped into uneasy rest. Cole clutched his arm, trembling. Ramirez paced, jaw tight, his anger at the enemy masking his fear. Henderson lay against the wall, pale, breathing shallow, but still alive. And the commander watched her, always. Her father's words still burned in her chest. "Daughter." And she knew this silence she carried wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to all of them. Because sometimes, silence was the only thing that survived the noise. What happens when silence meets the sound of a dying man's breath? The chamber reeked of smoke and iron. The walls were painted with shadows of the fight they had just survived. The enemy bodies lay scattered like broken pieces of a story that should have ended, but hadn't. Because silence doesn't end. It lingers. It waits. And now it pressed down on them harder than ever. Henderson slumped against the wall, his hand clamped over the wound that had been growing darker, wetter, every step they'd taken since the ambush. His breaths were shallow now, each one scraped like glass. Cole hovered near him, panic raw on his face. We have to get him out. Now, he's not gonna last. The commander's jaw was stone. He didn't answer. Because there was no out. Not yet. The tunnels ahead wound deeper, and behind them lay enemies regrouping. They were trapped in silence. Ramirez cursed under his breath, packing like he could outwalk the weight pressing on them. We need a vac. Signal something. The commander finally snapped back. And give away our position. Bring the rest of them down on us. The two men stared at each other, tension like sparks between steel. Henderson coughed, weak, his voice a whisper. Doesn't matter, I know what's coming. His eyes turned not to Ramirez, not to the commander, to her. Always her. You know it too, don't you? He rasped. Her chest tightened. Because yes, she did know. This compound wasn't meant to let anyone walk free. Her silence answered where her voice could not. The commander saw it. He saw Henderson's words, saw her lack of denial. And something in him snapped. He stalked over, crouching in front of her, his eyes sharp, piercing. What aren't you telling us? She didn't move, didn't blink. His voice dropped lower. I saw you at that wall. I saw the way you froze, the way you touched it like it was yours. Her throat closed tight. He leaned closer. You've been carrying something this whole time, and I'm not letting this team die in the dark because you couldn't open your mouth. The chamber fell heavy. Ramirez stilled. Cole's wide eyes flicked between them. Henderson coughed blood into his hand. The silence was no longer hers alone. Now it belonged to them all. Her hands clenched around her rifle. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, to pour the truth into the smoke-filled air until it shattered the weight pressing on her chest. Her father's carving, his word, the way he had died here in these walls in silence. But if she did, what then? Would they honor it, or twist it? Would her father's final strength be turned into a mission report, a footnote, an order from someone who had never bled in these walls? No. His silence wasn't theirs. It was hers. She met the commander's glare and held it, unflinching. Her silence was her answer. Ramirez's voice broke the standoff. We don't have time for this. You want answers, fine, but answers won't get us out of here alive. The commander's jaw tightened. He stared at her a second longer, then pulled back. But his suspicion didn't fade. It grew sharper. Because silence under fire is louder than any confession. They pressed on, dragging Henderson between them. His boots scraped over stone, his breath rasped louder now. Each step was a battle he was losing. Cole muttered prayers under his breath, his voice shaking. Ramirez carried Henderson's weight on one side, sweat pouring down his face. The commander pushed ahead, scanning every shadow, every curve of the tunnels, his suspicion eating at him. And she walked at the rear, her eyes always searching, her silence heavier than her rifle. Because she knew what they didn't. This wasn't just a mission. It was a graveyard. Henderson's voice came again, weak, slurred. Tell me, just tell me, was it worth it? She froze inside. Worth what? Her silence. Her father's. His final word carved into stone. Her lips trembled, but no sound escaped. She wanted to tell him it was. That silence carried strength when words would shatter. But before she could, his body jerked, his cough tearing through the tunnel. Ramirez cursed, pulling him tighter. Stay with me. Cole's eyes brimmed with panic. We're losing him. The commander snapped, voice harsh. Move faster. But the tunnels didn't care. The silence didn't bend. And Henderson's breaths grew thinner. They reached a narrow passage where the ceiling dipped low, forcing them to crouch. Their flashlights cut through darkness in shaky beams. Then echoes. Footsteps. Not theirs. Enemy. The silence shattered. The commander's fist went up, weapons raised. The tunnels squeezed tighter, too small for cover, too close for retreat. They were boxed in. Ramirez cursed under his breath, steadying Henderson against the wall. Cole's hands shook as he raised his rifle. Her heart pounded, but her breath was steady. Because silence doesn't break in fear. It sharpens. The first shadow appeared at the far end, a figure moving fast, rifle up. Her shot cracked before the others even exhaled. The body dropped. Then another and another. The tunnel lit with fire. Muzzle flashes burned, smoke filled the air, bullets sparking against stone. They fired back, every shot deafening in the close space. Cole screamed, half in fear, half in rage. Ramirez bellowed orders, dragging Henderson behind him. The commander's voice cut sharp through chaos. Hold the line. But it wasn't their voices that steadied the fight. It was her silence. Precise, focused, unbreaking. One shot, one body, again and again. Until the tunnel quieted. Until the silence returned. The men gasped for air, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. Ramirez checked Henderson. His pulse was weak, his skin clammy. Cole looked at her like she wasn't one of them at all. Like her silence was something inhuman, something carved from the same stone as this compound. The commander wiped blood from his face, eyes narrowing at her again. And this time he didn't whisper. This isn't luck, this isn't training, you know this place, don't you? The words hit like rounds. Ramirez froze. Cole turned, eyes wide. The air hung heavy. Her silence was the only sound. And it spoke louder than words ever could. Henderson coughed, his voice rasping through blood. If she knows something, let her keep it. Some truths, he sucked in a shallow breath, aren't meant for all of us. Then his eyes slid closed. Cole shook him, desperate. No, no, stay awake. Ramirez pressed fingers to his throat, jaw clenching. He's still here, barely. But Henderson's words lingered. Like he had understood her silence better than anyone. Like he had carried his own. The commander's gaze locked with hers, burning. But he didn't ask again. Because Henderson's dying voice had said enough. They moved on, slower now, dragging the weight of a man who might not make it. And she carried something heavier still. Her father's silence. Her own. And now Henderson's too. Because sometimes the loudest strength in war is what's never spoken. What happens when silence is all that remains. The tunnel sloped upward now, the air shifting, faint with the scent of wind and dust. A promise of escape if they could reach it. Behind them, echoes of movement, the enemy regrouping. Ahead, the last stretch of stone and shadow. Between those two worlds, a dying man, a team on the edge, and her silence. Henderson drifted in and out, his head lolling as Ramirez and Cole dragged his weight. His blood left a thin trail over the stone, a red map of their passage. Cole's face was pale, lips moving in prayers no one could hear over the pounding of their boots. Ramirez's teeth were clenched, every muscle straining. The commander pushed ahead, scanning corners, counting seconds, calculating odds. And she brought up the rear, rifle steady, eyes hard. Because she knew what they didn't. This tunnel didn't lead to freedom. It led to a choice. They reached a chamber where the ceiling split in two. One path angled steep and narrow, sunlight faint at the top, flickering like a dying star. The other path fell deeper, into blackness that smelled of stone and memory. The commander's fist went up, halting the group. Two routes, he muttered. His eyes scanned the faint light, then the dark descent. Ramirez's breath came in ragged bursts. We take the light, always the light. Cole nodded frantically, clutching Henderson tighter. But her chest tightened. Because she knew that light wasn't freedom. It was a trap. The compound was built that way. Her father had said it once long ago, when she was just a girl listening to his stories by lantern flame. The light will lie to you. The dark will save you. And here it was. His silence carved into stone, alive in her memory. The commander turned to her, suspicion carved deep in his face. Which way? The silence swelled. Her father's voice echoed inside her head. Choose, girl. Silence means nothing if it can't protect the ones you carry. Her rifle lowered just slightly. Her hand lifted toward the darkness. Ramirez's eyes flared. Are you out of your mind? We go down there, we're dead. Cole shook his head violently. Light, we have to take the light, please. But the commander didn't look at them. He looked at her. Because he understood now. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't hopping. She knew. And though the rage of unanswered questions still burned in him, trust, raw, reluctant, cut through. Dark it is, he said. They moved fast down the black throat of stone. The air grew colder, damp, heavy. The faint light of freedom shrank behind them. But the enemy voices above grew sharper, louder. Gunfire cracked, ricocheting off walls. Bullets chased them into darkness. Ramirez cursed, firing back blindly. Cole screamed, dragging Henderson's limp body. The commander barked orders, his voice steady, unyielding. And she was silent. Her shots precise, her breath calm. Her silence carved a path through chaos, just as her father's had before. The passage twisted, narrowed, then opened again into a cavern where cold air rushed in like breath. Wind. Real wind. A crack in the stone, faint light filtering through. Escape. But it wasn't wide enough for all, not quickly, not with Henderson unconscious. The commander's jaw tightened, he saw it, so did Ramirez. And her silence knew the choice before anyone spoke it. Someone had to hold the line. Ramirez slammed Henderson down near the gap, his hands shaking. We can get him through, we can get out. Cole's tears streaked through dirt. We're so close, please, we can't stop now. The commander turned, scanning the tunnel they'd fled. Shadows moved in the distance, boots pounding closer. He looked at her. Because he already knew. And so did she. Her silence answered. She stepped forward, planting herself between the darkness and the men. Rifle raised. Feet steady. The commander's eyes burned. No, not you. But she didn't move. Didn't blink. Her silence was iron. Ramirez cursed, rage and sorrow spilling at once. Damn it, no, we can fight together, we can. But Henderson stirred weakly, his voice a rasp through blood. Let her, she knows. His eyes, half-lidded, found hers. Don't waste it. His breath shuddered. His silence joined hers. The commander's fists clenched. He wanted to drag her, force her through that gap, demand she live, demand she speak. But war doesn't give what it takes. And he saw in her eyes the same fire he'd seen on that wall, the same fire that had kept them alive when everything else should have ended. So he didn't fight her. He just nodded, once hard. A soldier's farewell. Ramirez shoved Henderson and Cole toward the gap, cursing under his breath. Damn it all. The commander gave her one last look, eyes sharp with everything words could never carry. Then they slipped through, dragging the wounded, pulling the light behind them. Leaving her in the dark. The footsteps came. Dozens, maybe more. Shadows filled the tunnel, rifles raised, voices harsh. She stood her ground. Her silence didn't tremble. It burned. The first enemy appeared. Her shot cracked, sharp as a blade. One fell. Another. Again. Again. Her silence became thunder, every shot a word, every body a sentence. She didn't scream, didn't shout. Because silence carried more than noise ever could. It carried memory. It carried her father. It carried Henderson. It carried them all. The enemy swarmed, the chamber filling with fire and smoke. But she held. Until the last magazine. Until the last round. until the last breath. When the commander and his men stumbled into the night, dragging Henderson through the crack, the dawn was breaking. The sun painted the sky red gold, the air fresh and cold. Freedom! They collapsed on the rocks outside, gasping, bloodied, alive. Ramirez cursed the silence. Cole sobbed into Henderson's shoulder. And the commander? He turned back to the crack in the stone. He listened. Gunfire echoed, faint, distant. Then faded. Then nothing. Only silence. The men sat in the dawn, alive because of her. And though no words were spoken, they understood. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was sacrifice. It was strength. It was the last, unbroken sound of a soldier who had carried more than words ever could. The silence remains,